When people hear the phrase emotional abuse, they often imagine hurtful words, explosive arguments, maybe chronic criticism or neglect. And that's not wrong. Emotional abuse absolutely causes damage, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But here's where things get complicated, and where many people get stuck for years. Emotional abuse is about harmful behavior. Narcissistic abuse is about control. And if you don't understand that difference, you'll keep trying to solve the wrong problem. Emotional abuse can show up in relationships where someone lacks emotional skills, struggles with unresolved trauma, or doesn't know how to regulate anger or fear. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain it. There may be moments where that person feels remorse. There may be flashes of insight. There may even be an ability sometimes with help to recognize harm and try to change. The abuse is real, but it's not always strategic. Narcissistic abuse is different. It's not chaotic. It's not accidental. It's organized around one central goal: maintaining power. Every interaction, every conflict, every moment of closeness or withdrawal serves the objective. Control is the engine, and you are the fuel. That's why people who experience narcissistic abuse often say something that confuses others. They'll say, "It felt calculated," or "It was like they knew exactly where to hit me." And that's because over time, the narcissistic individual studies you. They learn your insecurities, your values, your fears, your hopes, not to connect but to leverage. What looks like intimacy early on is actually data collection. In emotional abuse, the hurtful behavior often erupts during stress, conflict, or emotional overwhelm. In narcissistic abuse, the harm shows up precisely when you assert independence, confidence, or boundaries. The moment you stop being easy to control is the moment the abuse intensifies. That's not coincidence. That's the system activating. And this is where so many people turn the blame inward. They say, "If I could just explain it better," or "if I stayed calmer," or "if I was more patient." But you're assuming the goal is understanding. It's not. The goal is dominance. You cannot communicate your way out of a power struggle with someone who believes entitlement is their birthright. Narcissistic abuse uses emotional harm as a tool. Gaslighting isn't confusion, it's a tactic. Silent treatment isn't space, it's punishment. Rage isn't loss of control, it's intimidation. Even affection can be weaponized, given and withdrawn to train you to behave in ways that serve their needs. Over time, you start editing yourself. You walk on eggshells. You anticipate reactions. You shrink not because you're weak, but because the environment rewards your silence and punishes your authenticity. This is why people coming out of narcissistic abuse often don't just feel sad or angry. They feel erased. They don't trust their perceptions. They question their memory. They doubt their worth. Emotional abuse hurts your feelings. Narcissistic abuse attacks your autonomy. And here's something important to say out loud: narcissistic abuse does not require yelling, insults, or overt cruelty. Some of the most damaging narcissistic abuse is subtle. It's the constant invalidation, the shifting standards, the way your needs are always framed as too much, the way their needs are treated as urgent, unquestionable, and central. Control doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks quiet, reasonable, even caring on the surface. People often ask, but what if they had a hard childhood? Or what if they didn't mean it that way? Those questions make sense because you're empathic. But intent becomes irrelevant when the pattern never changes and the power imbalance always benefits one person. Harm doesn't have to be malicious to be devastating. But in narcissistic abuse, the absence of accountability tells you everything you need to know. Understanding this distinction isn't about labeling someone as a villain. It's about clarity. When you misinterpret narcissistic abuse as emotional misunderstanding, you stay engaged in endless repair attempts. You keep offering empathy to someone who sees empathy as a weakness to exploit, and that keeps you trapped. Once you see that the core issue is control, not conflict, you stop negotiating with the abuse. You stop explaining yourself into exhaustion. You stop trying to earn basic respect. You start asking a different question. A more powerful one. What do I need to reclaim my agency? Because healing doesn't begin when they change. It begins when you see the system clearly and choose yourself anyway. Once you understand that narcissistic abuse is about control, the next distinction becomes almost unavoidable: accountability. This is where the gap between emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse widens into something you can't unsee. In emotionally abusive dynamics, accountability is possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. In narcissistic abuse, accountability is functionally absent, and that absence isn't a flaw in the system, is the system. In emotionally abusive relationships, when harm is pointed out, there's at least the potential for discomfort to lead to reflection. The person may feel shame. They may feel regret. They may struggle, resist, backslide, but somewhere inside there's a recognition that harm occurred. That recognition is the doorway to repair. It's the difference between someone saying, "I don't like hearing this," and someone saying, "That didn't happen," or "You made me do it." With narcissistic abuse, accountability threatens the entire structure. To take responsibility would mean acknowledging imperfection, limitation, or vulnerability, and that's intolerable. So instead, responsibility is rerouted, it's minimized, it's reframed, it's projected. The harm always belongs to someone else. And more often than not, it's placed squarely on you. This is why conversations with narcissistic individuals feel so disorienting. You're talking about impact, and they're talking about intent. You're naming behavior, and they're dissecting your tone. You're describing pain, and they're listing your flaws. The goal is not resolution, it's escape. Escape from responsibility, escape from shame, escape from being seen clearly. Apologies, when they appear, are often hollow. They're conditional. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry, but you pushed me." Or my personal favorite, "I guess I'm just a terrible person then." These aren't apologies. They're maneuvers. They shift the focus away from the harm and back into your reaction, your sensitivity, your supposed unreasonableness. And before you know it, you're comforting the person who hurt you. In emotional abusive dynamics, when accountability does emerge, it looks different. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. It doesn't center the injured ego. It centers the impact. There's an effort to listen without rewriting history. There's an attempt, even if imperfect, to change behavior over time. And that consistency is key. Real accountability isn't a moment. It's a pattern. Narcissistic abuse thrives on the opposite. Promises are made, then broken. Insight appears briefly, then vanishes. Just enough self-awareness is displayed to keep you hopeful. You start thinking this time they really get it. But if accountability were real, the behavior would change, not just the language around it. And this is where self-doubt takes root. You start wondering if you're asking for too much. You tell yourself that nobody's perfect. You minimize your own pain because you've been trained to. But accountability doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. And honesty is exactly what narcissistic abuse cannot tolerate. Let's talk about blame for a moment. In narcissistic abuse, blame is not a response, it's a reflex. If they're late, it's because you distracted them. If they're angry, it's because you provoked them. If they hurt you, it's because you were too sensitive. The narrative is airtight. There's no room for mutual responsibility. Because mutuality implies equality, and equality undermines control. This is why trying harder doesn't work. Being calmer doesn't work. Being clearer doesn't work. You're playing by the rules of accountability with someone who refuses to acknowledge the rulebook. And every time you engage, the burden of repair lands back on you. One of the most painful realizations for people in narcissistic abuse is this: closure does not come from being understood. It comes from understanding the pattern. Once you see that accountability is consistently absent, not just once, not just during stress, but always, you can stop personalizing the refusal. This isn't about your communication skills. It's not about timing. It's not about empathy. It's about a person who cannot tolerate responsibility, because responsibility collapses the illusion they are protecting at all costs. And when you accept that, something shifts. You stop waiting for the apology that will never arrive in a meaningful form. You stop explaining the harm to someone invested in misunderstanding it. You redirect your energy away from convincing and toward protecting, because healing doesn't require their accountability. It requires your clarity. Once you grasp that narcissistic abuse is rooted in control and sustained by a refusal of accountability, another truth begins to stand out: pattern. Emotional abuse can be inconsistent. Narcissistic abuse is not. It is predictable, cyclical, and self-reinforcing. And that predictability is not comforting. It's trapping. In emotionally abusive relationships, the hurtful behavior often spikes during moments of stress, financial strain, illness, major life changes, conflict that overwhelms coping skills. There may be long stretches where things feel calm or even healthy. That doesn't make the abuse acceptable, but it does mean it isn't always the organizing principle of the relationship. The harm is episodic, not structural. Narcissistic abuse, on the other hand, runs on a loop. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It often begins with idealization. You're seen, valued, admired, sometimes intensely. You feel chosen, understood, elevated. This stage isn't fake affection, it's strategic affection. It creates attachment quickly, and attachment creates leverage, then something shifts. Maybe you assert a need. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you simply become human instead of perfect. The devaluation begins subtle at first. A comment here, a look there. The warmth cools. Confusion creeps in. You start working harder to get back to what you thought was connection. Gaslighting often weaves its way in at this point. Your perceptions are questioned. Your reactions are labeled as overreactions. Events are rewritten. You begin to doubt your own memory, not because you're weak, but because the environment is destabilizing by design. When reality feels uncertain, control becomes easier. And when you push back or when the narcissistic individual senses they're losing influence, punishment follows. This can look like rage, withdrawal, stonewalling, or sudden cruelty. The message is clear, even if it's never spoken. Compliance brings relief. Autonomy brings pain. Sometimes there's a return to warmth, an apology, a moment of tenderness, just enough to pull you back in. This is not repair, it's reinforcement. It resets the cycle and strengthens the emotional bond. The unpredictability becomes addictive. Your nervous system starts chasing calm in a storm you didn't create. In emotionally abusive dynamics, cycles may exist, but they're not as rigid. The same triggers don't always produce the same responses. There may be genuine attempts to break the pattern. With narcissistic abuse, the cycle is the relationship. It doesn't resolve, it resets. This is why people often say, but there were good times. And they're right. The good times are part of the mechanism. Without them, you'd leave sooner. The cycle keeps hope alive while steadily eroding your stability. You stay, not because you're naive, but because your brain is trying to make sense of conflicting signals. And here's something critical. The cycle is not driven by your behavior. Many survivors spend years trying to identify the magic formula, what to say, how to act, how to be to avoid the next downturn. But the cycle will continue regardless, because it serves the narcissistic individual's need, not the health of the relationship. As the pattern repeats, something else happens. Your baseline shifts. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel normal. Your tolerance for chaos increases. Your sense of self shrinks. You become hypervigilant, not because you're anxious by nature, but because the environment is unsafe. Predictability, in this context, is devastating. You start anticipating the phases. You brace for the drop. You wait for the punishment. And in doing so, you lose access to spontaneity, joy, and trust. Life becomes about managing the cycle instead of living freely. This is also why leaving narcissistic abuse is so hard. The cycle creates emotional whiplash. Even after separation, your nervous system may still expect the pattern to restart. Silence feels unfamiliar. Calm feels suspicious. Healing takes time because the cycle trained your body, not just your mind. Recognizing the pattern is not about assigning blame. It's about reclaiming agency. When you can name the cycle, you stop chasing explanations that don't exist. You stop believing that the next good phase means things are different. You see the structure, not just the moments. And once you see the structure, you can step out of it. Because patterns only have power when they're mistaken for love, conflict, or misunderstanding. This was never chaos, it was choreography. By the time someone begins to recognize the cycle, another layer of damage has usually already taken hold: identity erosion. This is where the distinction between emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse becomes especially clear. Emotional abuse wounds emotions. Narcissistic abuse reshapes who you believe you are. It doesn't just hurt you, it destabilizes your sense of self. In emotionally abusive relationship, people often feel hurt, angry, or rejected, but they generally retain a core sense of who they are. They may say that behavior was wrong, or I didn't deserve that, even if they're shaken. There's pain, but there's still an internal anchor. With narcissistic abuse, that anchor slowly dissolves. This happens because narcissistic abuse targets identity directly. Over time, your preferences are questioned, your reactions are minimized, Your memories are challenged. Your strengths are reframed as flaws. You're told you're too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional, too independent, too much, and somehow never enough. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, relentless increments that feel almost reasonable in the moment. Gaslighting plays a central role here. When someone repeatedly denies your reality, corrects your experience, or insists that events didn't happen the way you remember them, you start outsourcing your sense of truth. You stop trusting your own perception and begin relying on theirs. That's not because you lack intelligence. It's because constant invalidation wears down even the strongest mind. Over time, you may notice that decision-making becomes harder. You second-guess yourself. You ask for permission instead of acting on instinct. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you misheard, misinterpreted, or overreacted. Emotional abuse can make you feel bad about a situation. Narcissistic abuse makes you feel bad about yourself. Another hallmark of identity erosion is the loss of voice. You start speaking less freely. You edit your words before they leave your mouth. You anticipate how something will be received and decide it's safer not to say it at all. This isn't peacekeeping, it's self-silencing. And self-silencing becomes survival when authenticity is punished. What makes this particularly painful is that many people who experience narcissistic abuse are empathetic, reflective, and conscientious. They're willing to look inward. They take feedback seriously. Those qualities, which are strengths in healthy relationships, become vulnerabilities in narcissistic ones. The more you self-reflect, the more responsibility you absorb, often for things that were never yours to carry. Slowly, the center of gravity shifts. The relationship becomes the reference point for your worth. You measure yourself by how well you're keeping things calm, how little you upsetting the other person, how effectively you're managing their moods. Your internal compass is replaced by external approval. And when approval is withheld, as it often is, you feel unmoored. This is why people emerging from narcissistic abuse often say, "I don't recognize myself anymore." They may struggle to identify their likes, values, or boundaries. They feel disconnected from their intuition. They may even feel embarrassed for how much they tolerated, which adds shame on top of confusion. But identity erosion is not a personal failure, it's a predictable outcome of prolonged psychological destabilization. In emotionally abusive dynamics, even when there is harm, the person's sense of self is not typically dismantled in this way. There may be conflict, pain, and resentment, but there's usually still room for self-definition. Narcissistic abuse leaves little space for that because an autonomous identity threatens control. Reclaiming identity is one of the most important and challenging parts of healing. It doesn't happen overnight. It begins with small acts of self-trust, believing your memory, honoring your reactions, making choices without seeking permission, allowing yourself to want what you want without justification. This process can feel unfamiliar, even frightening, because your nervous system learned that self-expression came with consequences. But with time, consistency, and support, the fog lifts. You remember who you were before everything became about managing someone else. And perhaps most importantly, you learn this truth. The version of you that disappeared was not weak, it was buried. And buried things can be uncovered, because narcissistic abuse doesn't just hurt your feelings, it tries to convince you that you don't exist. Once your sense of self has been chipped away, the natural instinct is to try to repair, to fix the relationship, to heal the other person, to find the right words that will finally make things make sense. This is where one of the most painful differences between emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse becomes clear. Emotional abuse, in some cases, can be addressed through accountability, boundaries, and sustained effort. Narcissistic abuse cannot, and that realization is both devastating and liberating. In emotionally abusive relationships, when there is genuine accountability, boundaries can lead to change, not perfection, not instant transformation, but movement. A person may resist at first, stumble, even fail repeatedly. But if they are capable of empathy and responsibility, boundaries serve as information. They communicate what is acceptable, what is harmful, and what needs to change. Repair, while difficult, remains possible. Narcissistic abuse does not operate in that framework. Boundaries are not experienced as guidance, they are experienced as threats. When you set a boundary with someone who relies on control to maintain their sense of self, you're not inviting collaboration, you're challenging their authority. And the response is rarely introspection, it's escalation. Many people discover this the hard way. They read the books, they learn the scripts, they try calm communication, they use I statements. They explain their needs with clarity and compassion, and instead of improvement, the behavior intensifies. The narcissistic individual may mock the boundary, ignore it, reinterpret it, or punish you for daring to have one. What was once covert becomes overt. What was subtle becomes sharp. This is why advice that works in healthy or even mildly unhealthy relationships often fails spectacularly in narcissistic ones. Techniques designed to foster mutual understanding assume a baseline of goodwill. Narcissistic abuse has no such baseline. The goal is not connection, it's compliance. Distance, in this context, is not avoidance. It's protection. Whether that distance is emotional, psychological, or physical, it creates space for your nervous system to settle and your clarity to return. Without constant exposure to manipulation, your thinking becomes sharper. Your instincts come back online. You begin to see the relationship without the fog of hope and fear. This doesn't mean distance is easy. Many people feel guilt when they pull away. They worry they're being cruel, dramatic, or unforgiving, but that guilt often comes from years of being conditioned to prioritize someone else's needs over their own. Choosing distance isn't punishment, it's triage. One of the most important shifts happens when you stop trying to be understood by the person who harmed you. In emotionally abusive dynamics, understanding can lead to change. In narcissistic abuse, understanding is often weaponized. Your vulnerability becomes ammunition. Your explanations become leverage. Your empathy becomes an entry point. So healing begins when you redirect that energy. Instead of asking, how can I make them see? You ask, what do I need to feel safe, stable, and whole? That question changes everything. It moves you out of negotiation and into self-preservation. Distance also disrupts the cycle. Without your emotional reactions, the patterns lose their fuel. This is why narcissistic individuals often escalate when they sense disengagement. The silence, the calm, the refusal to engage it destabilizes a system that depends on your participation. But here is the part people rarely talk about. Distance doesn't just protect you from them, it reconnects you to yourself. Away from constant invalidation, your identity begins to reassemble. You hear your own thoughts again. You feel your own preferences. You start making choices based on what aligns with you, not what avoids conflict. This is not about being cold or unkind. It's about recognizing that compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. You can understand someone's history, pain, or limitations without sacrificing your well-being. Empathy does not require proximity. For those hoping for closure, this is a hard truth. Closure does not come from one last conversation, one perfect explanation, or one long-awaited apology. Closure comes from consistency, from seeing the pattern clearly and choosing not to re-enter it. And when you do that, when you stop offering access to someone who uses access to harm, you begin to heal, slowly, steadily, and deeply. Because some relationships are meant to be fixed, they're meant to be left behind. By the time you reach this point, understanding control, recognizing the absence of accountability, seeing the cycle, reclaiming your identity, and choosing distance, you arrive at the most important realization of all. Understanding the difference between emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse is not an academic exercise. It's a turning point. It's the moment where confusion gives way to clarity, and clarity opens the door to freedom. For so long, many people stay stuck because they believe the situation can still be reasoned through. They think if they can just find the right explanation, the right compromise, the right level of patience, the relationship will finally become safe. That belief makes sense when you think you're dealing with emotional immaturity or poor communication. It becomes dangerous when the issue is narcissistic abuse. Mislabeling narcissistic abuse as just emotional abuse keeps you in self-blame. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You minimize the impact. You compare your pain to war stories and decide you don't deserve to leave. But when the abuse is systemic, when it targets your reality, identity, and autonomy, staying becomes a form of self-betrayal. Understanding the distinction gives language to experiences that once felt impossible to explain. Suddenly, the exhaustion makes sense. The brain fog makes sense. The loss of confidence makes sense. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what happened to me? That shift alone is profoundly healing. With clarity comes a new kind of responsibility, not to fix the other person, but to protect yourself. This doesn't mean becoming rigid or angry. It means becoming honest. Honest about what the relationship costs you. Honest about the patterns you've seen. Honest about what is unlikely to change. Freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds in choices. Choosing not to engage in circular arguments. Choosing not to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Choosing to trust your perception, even when it's uncomfortable. Each of these choices reclaims a piece of the self that was taken. There's often grief here. Grief for the relationship you hoped for. Grief for the version of the person you thought existed. Grief for the time and energy you invested trying to make something work that was never built on mutual respect. That grief is not a sign you made the wrong choice. It's a sign you care deeply. Many people also fear what life will look like without the relationship. Narcissistic abuse narrows your world. It makes the relationship feel central, even when it's harmful. Freedom can feel like emptiness at first, not because something is missing, but because so much noise is finally gone. In that quiet, you begin to hear yourself again. Understanding the difference also changes how you view the future. You become more discerning. You recognize red flags earlier. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy or control with care. You learn that love does not require self-abandonment, and connection does not demand suffering. This clarity extends beyond romantic relationships. It reshapes how you navigate families, workplaces, and friendships. You become less tolerant of dynamics that erode your sense of self. Not because you're harsh, but because you're aware, and perhaps, most importantly, understanding the distinction restores dignity. You realize you weren't weak for staying, you were hopeful. You weren't foolish, you were empathic. You weren't broken, you were responding to a profoundly destabilizing environment. Freedom, then, is not about proving anything to the person who harmed you. It's about living in alignment with your values, your truth, and your well-being. It's about choosing relationships where accountability exists, boundaries are respected, and identity is honored. Once you see the difference clearly, you stop negotiating with harm and start building a life that doesn't require your silence to survive.